Tashidilek and good evening. Today is the fifth day of the week-long virtual talk series on 4 principal commitments of His Holiness the Great 14th Dalai Lama. This initiative by the Department of Information and International Relations, Central Tibetan Administration, is a part of the year-long celebration of 2020 as a year of gratitude to His Holiness the Dalai Lama. This evening's panel on the 4 principal commitments of His Holiness the Dalai Lama will feature Dr. Lobsang Tenzin Negi, Executive Director of the Center for Contemplative Science and Compassion-Based Ethics at Emory University. Dr. Lobsang Tenzin Negi also holds a Geshe Haramba degree. We have Jetsunma Palmo, founder and director of Dongyu, Gatsal, Ling, Nunnery, and president of Sakyadita International Association of Buddhist Women. We will also hear from Gabriel Lafitte, scholar and researcher on Tibet's environment, and Professor John Powers, an author and professor of Asian Studies and Buddhism, Australian National University.
Tashidilek. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to the Department of Information and International Relations at the CTA for organizing this week-long virtual talk series on the 4 commitments of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and for the opportunity for me to join the department in the celebration of this year of gratitude to His Holiness. Promotion of human values is the first of His Holiness's 4 main commitments, and I'm deeply honored and humbled to be asked to speak on this enduring legacy of His Holiness. His Holiness explains what these human values are and the significance of their promotion in these words. My first commitment is the promotion of human values such as compassion, forgiveness, tolerance, contentment, and self-discipline. All human beings are the same. We all want happiness and do not want suffering. Even people who do not believe in religion recognize the importance of these human values in making their lives happier. When it comes to human well-being, His Holiness is well aware of the importance of material resources to meet our basic needs, but he recognizes that we also have emotional needs, and those needs cannot be fulfilled by material resources alone. Our emotional well-being largely depends on our inner resources. And that is why His Holiness, in his book entitled Ethics for a New Millennium, calls for a spiritual revolution. And I quote here, "A revolution is called for certainly, but not a political, an economic, or even a technical revolution. We have had enough experiences of these during the past century to know that a purely external approach will not suffice. What I propose is a spiritual revolution." In calling for a spiritual revolution, His Holiness is certainly not advocating a religious solution to our problems, but rather he is calling for a greater appreciation for these basic human values, values like love and compassion. His Holiness refers to these basic human values as basic human spirituality, while religious values he refers to as the religion-based values. Now, His Holiness provides a very brilliant metaphor to distinguish these 2 forms or the 2 dimensions of spirituality. For His Holiness, basic spirituality or the basic human values are like clean water or the clear, clean air, while religious values, the religion-based values, are like different flavors of tea. While we can certainly appreciate the various flavors of tea, but we don't absolutely need those in order for our survival. But we do need clean water if we were to survive. So in that sense, values like love and compassion for His Holiness are not just mere luxuries, they are necessities. Without them, humanity cannot survive. In proposing the spiritual development, His Holiness is also not proposing that the material development is unnecessary. In fact, His Holiness is keenly aware of the enormous benefits that come from material progress or the development. For example, as a humanity today, we are much better off than before. Many of the illnesses that plagued us in the past, like the chickenpox, measles, and other contagious diseases, through the advancement in science and technology, that many of these illnesses have been eradicated. Similarly, the child mortality is way low today compared to the past. And many of our conveniences that we enjoy today are the result of this material progress. But that is not to say that material progress is enough for our well-being and happiness. In fact, the excessive focus on the material development and the neglect to our inner cultivation or the inner development of these basic human values has led to many of the problems that we are facing today. Despite all the benefits that we are enjoying due to this unprecedented progress in the material world, we still are facing many problems. In fact, many of these problems are only getting worse. For example, increasing gap between rich and poor. That is the source of suffering for many people. It creates many complications for a society and for the individuals themselves. We are also seeing a growing tension caused by these polarizing ideologies along religious lines or the political kind of divide. And they also are source of many problems today. Perhaps one of the most alarming concerns for us today is the global warming. For the past 20 years, each year has been hotter than the year before. And this year, year 2020, is the hottest year ever in the recorded history. If the temperatures continue to rise at this level, it won't be very long before much of our world will become inhospitable, causing millions of people to migrate in other places. And these climate refugees can face many problems themselves, but also can give rise to many conflicts. Scientists refer to our age as an Anthropocene age, an age defined as a period where the actions or the behaviors of one species, us humans, have such serious impact on the very integrity of the world, the ecology, the environment itself. Our insatiable kind of desire for success, that leading to many unwise actions, are the source of this climate change. In addition to these major kind of societal problems, the problems that will require our collective solution, collective action to solve, we are also faced with this unprecedented rise in mental health problems. World Health Organization estimates that over 970 million people around the world each year suffers from some form of mental illness like depression or anxiety and other forms of mental illnesses. Even among the healthcare community, for example, here in the United States, a community that is perhaps most informed of health and well-being, we find a rising number of mental health problems. For example, a study that is involving 167 cross-sectional studies around 43 countries, it finds that depression among the medical students is as high as 27%. Another study that reviewed, again, 31 cross-sectional studies. Another mental health problem that the world faces today is burnout, particularly in the developed countries, and particularly among the healthcare community. For example, among the doctors in the United States, 54% of the doctors experience this burnout. And the cost of burnout is enormous, not only for the individual who is suffering. They may end up losing job or not being able to function well, making mistake in their medical practices and so forth. But also for the medical system itself, it has a huge cost to the system when they have to replace a surgeon, a doctor. So the burnout is one of the issues that we are seeing at rise also. Another issue that is a source of major concern today is this feeling of loneliness. Loneliness is a public health epidemic, according to Dr. Vivek Murthy, who was the Surgeon General during Obama administration in the United States. He says that when he began practicing medicine and seeing patients, he quickly realized that the greatest pathology that he saw was not heart disease or diabetes. It was in fact loneliness, and it was impacting the ability of his patients to live healthy and fulfilling lives. 40% of adults in America report feeling this sense of loneliness. 20% or 22% of millennials report having actually no close friends. The impact of loneliness on our health is enormous. Scientists say that negative consequences of loneliness on our health is as great as smoking 20 cigarettes per day. We know that smoking so many cigarettes seriously undermine our health, lead to many problems, lung-related problems, cancer, and so forth. And that is why there's a huge industry, that it focuses on reducing smoking among the populations. The impact of loneliness on our health is in fact worse than obesity. Obesity is related to many of our illnesses like the diabetes and the blood pressures and so forth, and which then cause many other problems. But actually, impact on our longevity, of loneliness is worse than being obese. These emotional problems not only affect the adults, in fact, the adolescents and the children are at very high risk of having these emotional problems. In the United States, for example, a few years ago, a Time magazine article reported that over 3 million teens ages between 12 and 17 reported at least one episode of major depressive disorder. Anxiety among teen girls was even higher, 30%, and among boys, about 20%. Hopelessness also was very high. 30% of teens reported regular feelings of sadness or hopelessness. So despite all the progress that we have seen in the material world, if we are faced with so many problems today, we have to rethink about what is meant by progress. How do we measure progress? And His Holiness the Dalai Lama has over and over again has emphasized that in measuring our progress, we must take into consideration the quality of our life, our happiness. And that is what the United Nations in 2011 also considered and adopted a resolution. And a resolution to take happiness as a factor towards a holistic approach to our development. And that resolution led to the annual publishing of World Happiness Report. In their World Happiness Report in 2017, they presented the key determinants, the key factors contributing to our happiness. It was based on a survey done with thousands of people in 4 countries: United States, United Kingdom, Australia, and Indonesia. Here they found that main contributor to our happiness was our mental health. But when they examined what contributed to our mental health as adult, they found that our childhood mental health is a big predictor of our adulthood mental health. And further, as they examine what contributes to a child's mental health problems, they found that parents' mental health, particularly the mother's mental health, is a big contributor to the child's mental health. Along with this, they also found that school ambience, school environment, where the children went, also have a huge impact on the child's mental health. They conclude their report by emphasizing the implications of these findings. For example, as they say, which school a child went to, both primary and secondary, predicts as much of how the child develops as all the characteristics we can measure of the mother and father. This is true of what determines the child's emotional health, their behavior, and their academic achievement. Implications for policy are momentous. In one of the World Happiness reports, the authors include a chapter on the promotion of secular ethics. And here they specifically encourage to incorporate the secular ethics as envisioned by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And here I quote, "So we need a new ethics which incorporates the best values to be found in all religions, but which is equally convincing to people with no religious faith at all. As the Dalai Lama has put it, in today's secular and multicultural societies, any religious-based answer to the problem of our neglect of inner values could not be universal, and so would be inadequate. We need an approach to ethics that can be equally acceptable to those with religious faith and those without. We need a secular ethics." His Holiness offers such a fresh vision for humanity. His decades of dialogue with scientists, educators, and policymakers have led to major paradigm shifts in our perspectives on the significance for human values like compassion, how we promote our health and well-being, and the education itself. And in all these fields, His Holiness sees the importance of bridging the science and spirituality, what he calls the convergence of science and spirituality. In his book, Universe in the Single Atom, The Convergence of Science and Spirituality, His Holiness says that and I quote, "Today, in the first decade of the 21st century, science and spirituality have the potential to be closer than ever and to embark upon a collaborative endeavor that has far-reaching potential to help humanity meet the challenges before us." His Holiness recognizes the insight that the science brings into understanding our human condition, but also he is aware that how the contemplative tradition, the spiritual traditions, can also shed light on our human condition, particularly those aspects of the spirituality that do not need to be bound to a religious belief. What His Holiness often calls Buddhist science, for example, where a systematic understanding about the emotions and mind, how the mind and emotions work and how they can be transformed. These two traditions can truly complement each other, and from there we can have a very different understanding of our human condition. Over the last 4 decades, His Holiness has engaged scientists and educators and policymakers in dialogues. And through these dialogues, we are seeing an emerging shift, a paradigm shift, if you will, in how we understand the role of compassion and these basic human values for our survival, our society, and our well-being. We also see a very new perspective on how to understand our health and well-being, how to study, how to scientifically, research that. And also there is a much greater awareness about what education should be like, how the education must incorporate these social, emotional competencies, if you will, these basic human values in the education. There is a growing appreciation among scientists today about how compassion may have been so critical for our social life and our evolution as social beings. What was once a conventional position among scientists, that is, the evolution or the survival through competition, the survival of the fittest, is now being replaced by new thinking. And this new thinking tells that we evolve or survive, flourish through cooperation, hence the evolution through cooperation. When it comes to social beings like us, the cooperation is key, but what promotes cooperation is trust among each other. But that trust is built, that when we can treat each other with care and kindness. So the compassion or the caring, heart becomes key to our survival. In fact, our survival is driven by the concern for each other, care for each other. Even the father of evolutionary biology, Charles Darwin, he recognized that what he called the sympathy instead of compassion is the same thing. He said that the strongest instinct, one of the strongest instincts we as social beings have is sympathy. And he's noticed that in the species where the sympathy is abundant among each other, among the fellows, those species thrived. Species where the sympathy among the members was missing, those species perished. So this is such a growing appreciation today. And this is really, really, very encouraging. This is largely due to His Holiness's efforts, of his encouragement to the scientists to see differently, look differently, understand differently. When it comes to understanding our health and well-being, the traditional models have been this kind of disease-centered model. What is wrong with us? What kind of problem is there? And just fixing that. But His Holiness brings a very new approach to our health and well-being. Not only we need to understand our illness and so forth, and then to how to cure, but most importantly, we must understand those positive mental states and how to nurture, how to cultivate them. In fact, one of the leading scientists, Dr. Richard Davidson, who has been in conversations with His Holiness for many, many times now, many years, he talks about how it was His Holiness who encouraged him, who gave him this direction to see the health or research the health in a different way, not through the disease kind of model, but health model, to understand those healthy states of the mind, that how they can be promoted. And that's why that the center that he has established at the University of Wisconsin, it's called the Center for Healthy Minds, or the Center for Investigating Healthy Mind. His Holiness's leadership and contribution to the convergence of science and spirituality is unprecedented. And when it comes to our modern education, His Holiness offers a very fresh approach to education. An education that is holistic, that pays attention to both the education of heart and the mind, both the character and the intellect. And this is what he calls the secular ethics in education, or educating the heart and mind, otherwise today known as social, emotional, and ethical learning. In his books, Ethics for the New Millennium and Beyond Religion, His Holiness has presented a comprehensive framework for education of heart and mind, or the secular ethics. It is drawn from his many years of dialogues with the scientists. At Emory University, we have been very fortunate and honored to be entrusted with this very important mission of His Holiness, that is to create a comprehensive framework as well as the curricula from all the way from kindergarten to university level for what he calls the secular ethics in education, or otherwise known as social, emotional, and ethical learning. In designing the framework for this program, the contents of the framework are drawn from His Holiness's own works, such as Ethics for a New Millennium, Beyond Religion, and numerous other writings. But the structure of the framework is drawn from other education leaders, such as Dr. Daniel Goleman and Dr. Peter Senge. In Triple Focus, A New Approach to Education, a book co-authored by these two education leaders, they offer a very nice structure to arrange the contents of C-learning, or secular ethics. Triple focus, or the three focuses, refer to inner focus, other focus, and the outer focus. Inner focus refers to our self-awareness. It is the awareness of our own thoughts, feelings, emotions, and so forth, which leads to self-regulation, self-management. Other focus represents our awareness of others' needs, thoughts, feelings, and so forth. This basically represents our empathy, which is the precursor for compassion for others. And the outer focus, it represents systems thinking, understanding the situation or the event from the broader perspective. Mapping on those three focuses, C-learning framework is organized around three domains and three dimensions. The three domains refer to personal domain, social domain, and systems domain. Personal domain is about our personal needs, our emotions, thought, feelings, and how to transform our personal lives. Social domain has to do with our interpersonal life, like the other focus. It's about seeing the needs of others, how to relate to others, how to work with others. And this has to do with, with empathy and compassion and so forth. The systems domain is about larger community. It's about needs of the larger community and issues faced by the larger community. To bring about transformation at these three levels, those three domains, C-learning framework incorporates three dimensions, what are known as awareness, compassion, and engagement. And in these three domains, you can see clearly the contribution from the spiritual traditions, like the one that His Holiness comes from. On the personal level, awareness is about self-awareness. It's about awareness into our own thoughts, emotions, reactions, which emotions and thought contribute to our happiness, well-being, which thoughts, emotions, and feelings lead to our suffering or tensions, and so forth. So, equipped with this awareness, we can begin to put our ups and downs or the adversities, the suffering, the problems in perspective, so that certain inevitable problems like the loss, the death, sickness and so forth, we can accept it as inevitable fact of life. But with this awareness, we are also able to then transform these adversities into the aids for our growth. We can learn from our mistakes. The mistakes don't become just simply a reflection of something that were not good, but rather mistakes present opportunities to learn and grow. And that kind of attitude is referred to as self-compassion. In the compassion dimension, that will be self-compassion, kindness towards oneself, or accepting our adversities with a certain kindness towards oneself. Engagement has then to do with the continuous practice, to how we can have certain impulse control of our impulses and behaviors that are destructive and so forth. So in a way, this has to do with, restraining ourselves from certain harmful actions. In the context of the three forms of ethics, it has to do with ethics of restraint, restraining ourselves from involving in certain behaviors and actions and of certain, reactions that contribute to a problem. Now, on the social domain level, awareness has to do with awareness of others' situation, others' needs, others' suffering, and so forth. So that when we are aware that how others are like us, who want to be happy, who want to be free from suffering, and so forth, then we can also put their situation in perspective. That with this kind of awareness, we can begin to empathize with others. We can have a compassion for others. That's the compassion towards others. And with this awareness and compassion combined, then we will be able to interact with others much more meaningfully, that contributing to their well-being and avoiding from their harms and so forth. So this, at this level, for social kind of domain, it's about, developing compassion, and in our interpersonal relations, developing forgiveness, tolerance, and so forth. So this is like, in this threefold model of ethics, it's about the virtue ethics, ethics of virtue, ethics of developing, virtuous states. And at the systems, level of the systems domain, awareness has to do with awareness of our interdependence, that how each and everything that we have, it comes from others, but also each and every event that we encounter also, is embedded in a larger set of cause and conditions and the factors. Understanding that is very, important. It's through that understanding that how we are interdependent with large number of beings, that we can begin to see that how others are just like us as well, and we can have this greater sense of common humanity. How we can see that how we are all same, in the sense we all want to be happy, we all want to be free from suffering. That is that kind of inclusiveness, if you will, that then can allow us to pay attention to the larger issues that the community or the whole world faces, like the global warming and the many systemic problems, like injustice, class, on the level of class, or the racial injustices, and so forth and so on. And this is where, equipped with the awareness of our common humanity and our interdependence, then we can be equipped with the tools to address these larger communal and global issues. So that's what the sea learning, basic kind of framework of the sea learning is. There are, of course, a number of other programs that fall under the umbrella of what is known as social and emotional learning, or SEL. And these programs also address our inner needs, like self-awareness, self-management, empathy, social skills, and responsible decision makings, and so forth. And for the past 30 years, this movement have been growing. There are hundreds of, perhaps thousands of schools. There are thousands of schools, and there are thousands of schools now where they have some form of social emotional learning programs. And a recent meta-analysis of the studies done with those programs, it shows that in schools where they have social emotional learning curriculum, compared to those where they don't have any such programs, students show greater degree of pro-social behaviors, like helping others and so forth. 10% decrease in antisocial behavior like bullying and so forth, and up to 14% greater academic achievement. They do better in their academic achievements. What sea learning adds to this existing field? In fact, sea learning enhances social and emotional learning field with many innovative components, including attention training, compassion and ethical discernment, systems thinking, resilience and trauma-informed practices. And because of these added components, Daniel Wellman refers to sea learning as SEL 2.0. Here he says, sea learning has been brilliant in finding ways to integrate all these pedagogical innovations into the classroom. I would call sea learning SEL 2.0, showing the way to the future direction for this critically important educational approach. As you may be aware, sea learning program was globally launched by His Holiness the Dalai Lama in April 2019 in New Delhi. Over 1,000 educators and policymakers from around 37 countries attended the launch. Thanks to the generosity and support of His Holiness, all sea learning program materials are freely available worldwide. In addition, anyone can access the Sea Learning 101 online program as well. In addition to the Sea Learning Companion or the Framework book, we have developed 3 levels of curricula: early elementary, late elementary, and middle school level. high school level curriculum is in the progress. It should be available soon. Sea learning materials are being translated in over a dozen languages, and sea learning programs are available now in many parts of the world. In only a year and a half since its launch, sea learning program has been introduced to over 48,000 educators in over 140 countries and hundreds of thousands of students around the world. Sea learning, otherwise known as secular ethics in education, is a precious gift to the world by His Holiness Dalai Lama to promote basic human values, to ensure the continued survival of humanity. Thousands of people around the world who are working with sea learning are personally inspired by His Holiness and deeply committed to realizing His Holiness's vision for a compassionate and ethical world for all, and for his aspiration for these inner values to become an integral part of our modern education. In conclusion, as I read the words of His Holiness's aspiration for the future of our education, please join me in committing ourselves to the realization of this grand vision. My hope and wish is that one day formal education will pay attention to what I call education of heart, just as we take for granted the need to acquire proficiency in basic academic subjects. I am hopeful that a time will come when we take it for granted that children will learn as part of their school curriculum the indispensability of inner values such as love, compassion, justice, and forgiveness. Thank you.
So, first of all, I would like to thank the Department of Information and International Relations for inviting me to give this speech on behalf of promoting religious harmony in the world. We all know that His Holiness the Dalai Lama is the main focus for Buddhism in the view of all the world. If you ask ordinary people in the street to name a Buddhist, they will say Dalai Lama, and a second one maybe they won't come up with anyone. So we are so fortunate that His Holiness is such an exemplar of all the qualities which are needed on the Buddhist path. I mean, if we had to have a spokesperson for Buddhism in this world, we could not choose anyone better than His Holiness. And one aspect of His Holiness' caring for global peace and harmony is his emphasis on religious harmony. We all know that His Holiness goes out of his way to meet with spokesmen from other religions, Hindus, Christians, Muslims, Jains, whoever. He is so interested to learn from them and to dialogue with them and to understand each other on a deeper level, that really we are very, very fortunate to have such a person here to lead us and to show us the way forward. One thing that His Holiness, of course, also does, apart from meeting with the leaders of all the religions and dialoguing with them and taking part in interfaith conferences, is that he says in general, when he gives talks, that people should take from Buddhism what they find helpful, what is useful for them in their lives. Take some of the ideas, some of the techniques, but it's not necessary to become a card-carrying Buddhist. That they can stay comfortably within their own faith, but just bring in other ideas and techniques from the Buddhist path to make them better Christians, better Hindus, better Muslims. And this is genuine religious harmony. We are not just trying to promote our own side. It's very difficult to understand where religions have gone wrong, because all religions say we should be good people, we should be kind, we should be loving, we should be generous, we should be ethical. Everybody's agreed. There's no argument about that. And yet there is so much disharmony among the religions. So many of the wars throughout history have been waged in the name of peace and love. Why is this? And so we have to think for ourselves what does genuine religious harmony really mean? So maybe we could take as an image the traditional idea of a mountain. So we're all climbing up this mountain, but different people climb up from different angles. Some go up the north face, some come up the south face, the east face, and so forth. They're going up different paths. They don't even recognize it's the same mountain because the view is different, the path is different, and it's only when we get up to the top that we have a 360-degree view that we begin to recognize maybe this is the same mountain. But then we go back down the same path again, so we don't experience, if we're on the north face, that there's a south face. We think only our path is the path up the mountain. Nobody else can get up to the mountain except on our path. And so this is one of the problems, that we don't recognize we are all on the same spiritual path coming from different directions. Very few ever get to the top. This is another problem. Most people get stuck halfway up the mountain if they get that far. And the other problem is that we get very involved with our mountaineering equipment. And the mountaineering equipment becomes the most important thing. And all our various, all the aids that we need for climbing the mountain become the focal point of our attention. And that's what we get attached to. We don't recognize that the whole point of this equipment is not the equipment, but to help us get up that mountain. So it's a problem, because mostly we only know our angle, our view. And we can't recognize that other views might also be just another facet of the same truth. Because truth itself is beyond words, it's beyond concepts, it's beyond all our rational thinking mind. I remember seeing an interview by a Russian Orthodox priest, Russian Orthodox Christian priest, who said that when he joined his novitiate, when he first joined, the first thing he was taught was that anything they thought or said about God, it was not that. Which is such wisdom. God, meaning ultimate reality, ultimate truth, cannot be named, cannot be spoken of, because everything is just part of our conceptual thinking mind. So then we grab to that concepts, words, love, goodness, truth, as if they were something real, as if they were something which we could grasp. But truth is beyond grasping, is beyond the conceptual thinking mind. We have to take a leap into the unknown. And then when we come back, we have to try to describe what we experienced. We will do it in the tradition to which we were raised. And then when we hear all these different words, we might think it's a different truth. But truth is one. How can it be different? And no religion has a copyright on truth. Every religion thinks they alone have the view. They alone have the way. And everyone else is doing their best, but they're inferior to my way. And this is one of the problems with gaining genuine appreciation of other religions. We cannot go to a religious conference with the idea that we alone have the truth. and everybody else is doing their best, but they don't understand things how they really are. We're the only ones that have the real copyright on reality. That's simply not true. We need to approach other religions with humility, with respect, with appreciation and curiosity. How are they walking the path? Because all religions have great strengths and also great weaknesses. No religion is totally, absolutely perfect in all respects. Some things are very good and very strong. For example, Buddhism is very, very strong on understanding the mind, on understanding our relationship with our external phenomena. Its philosophy is very profound, very deep. It is also very good on cultivating the qualities of loving kindness and compassion. It's not enough just to say to someone, be kind. There are methods for helping us, training the mind, opening the heart. And these Buddhists can share with everybody, because we all need to learn how to be more good and more kind. But Buddhism traditionally is a bit weak when it comes to actually putting all this loving kindness and compassion into action. In that, the Christians are far ahead of us. They have had so much social outreach for so many centuries. They don't just sit on their cushion thinking, may all beings be well and happy. They actually go out and try to make people well and happy, even in just a mundane sphere of activities. They have schools, hospitals, old age people's homes. There's so much compassionate outreach to benefit beings on this earth as much as they can. And there we can learn. And we are learning. Buddhism now around the world, around the globe, is taking much more active measures to relieve the sufferings of the world as much as they can on a mundane level. And this is good. Meantime, Christians have become more interested in meditation and how to cultivate loving kindness and compassion, how to understand the mind, how to reach to that level beyond the conceptual mind, to our genuine inner divinity. And so they look to the Buddhists. Buddhists are good at that. They've been doing it for millennia. So they very humbly come and learn how to meditate, and we can also learn from them how to take that compassion and bring it into the world. So in this way, we can all help and share our experiences with each other. This is so important. We don't have to go with the arrogance of thinking we're going to teach everybody else how things should be done. We go with a genuine humility, wanting to learn what they understand, what they have brought in, because all religions are suitable for the culture in which they have grown. Buddhism itself, of course, has adapted itself to the various countries to which it goes to, but also Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and so forth are very suitable for the cultures in which they have grown up. That's why they have flourished, because they speak to the psychological needs of the people where they have implanted themselves. If they were not right, they would never have been able to put down roots. It's sort of like food. You know, I mean, Tibetans think the most perfect food on earth is sampa, with maybe some nice succulent boiled meat and butter tea. Yummy! On the other hand, Koreans carry caseloads of kimchi with them wherever they go, because how can you eat food without kimchi? Indians love dal and rice. Italians love pasta. They're all nourishing food. Nobody gets killed by eating those foods. And they suit the physical constitution of the people that they're feeding. And so naturally people are very attached to their kind of food and think their kind of food is the best food in the world. And for them it is the best food. That's the point. There isn't one perfect food for everybody, you know, and we can share each other's food and be nourished by it. So this is the same with religions, that each one is nourishing their devotees. Each one helps their devotees to become better people and to, you know, realize and bring to actuality the goodness within us. But beyond that also, there is a level of deep understanding in all religions of a more mystical nature. I mean, it's not enough just to think, oh, you know, when we go to talk about other people's religions, we talk about the very most obvious, common base level and compare it with our higher philosophy and our higher meditation experiences to show how superior we are. Because all genuine spiritual paths have their side to them of deep philosophical understanding and also deep spiritual realizations. Buddhism is not unique. All religions have that side to them of deeper exploration of our inner reality by whatever name we call it. And we all understand that what obscures us from recognizing our own innate divinity by any name is the small self, is the small ego. All genuine spiritual traditions understand that. When we come together as an interspirituality, then we are completely in accord. We understand. The greatness of Buddhism is that it has such incredible techniques and such incredible understanding of how the mind functions and the levels of consciousness down to the most primordial, pristine awareness, the nature of the mind, our Buddha nature. But everybody has experienced that. They call it something different maybe. But that, we don't own Buddha nature. All Buddha beings have Buddha nature, and if they look, they can find it. They might go a different path, but they will find it. It's there. And this, I think, is very important. When we seek for religious harmony, we seek it on a deep level, not just on the level of dogma or the level of, yes, we all have to be good and kind. We also have to be perfect. And each religious path, maybe not so much religious, but spiritual path, is leading towards our innate perfection. And that's what we need to share with each other. An appreciation of how many ways there are to open up and experience our innate divinity. So when we meet with others of another religion, we need to listen. Not just tell them our side of the story. They, you know, so that they think that we are not even interested in them. We just want them to appreciate how incredible our path is. But our path is just one path. And what is more interesting is their path. And to encourage and share, have a dialogue, not a lecture, but a real opening. How many diverse ways there are to connect with our own genuine inner being and transform ourselves from ordinary humans to our genuine inner Buddha potential. There are so many paths for that, not just our path. And so we really appreciate that His Holiness goes out and through his being, he connects with so many great spiritual teachers. They feel immediately his openness and his acceptance and love for them. And so they open up also to him, because he is such an extraordinary being. He's a very, very great bodhisattva. And without believing in bodhisattvas, they know that. They know that he's not just an ordinary politician. He's a genuine, what the Tibetan people believe him to be. He really is that. He's very extraordinary. And not only does he reach out towards other religions, but he also does what he possibly can to help with religious harmony among the Buddhists. Because, as we all know, Buddhism spread from India through the centuries and settled in many countries in Asia. And again, it adapted itself to those countries. Sometimes I think of it like, if we think of the Dharma as like nectar, as like a beautiful liquid, then it has been poured into many different vessels. There are jade vessels and porcelain vessels and glass vessels and gold vessels, maybe even clay vessels. But despite the outer appearance of those vessels, very different from each other, the inner nectar is extraordinarily the same. And when we come to Buddhist conferences, and I find this especially with Sakyadita, the women's Buddhist conferences, when women, Buddhist women from all the various countries around the world, but especially Asia, come together and discuss their commonalities, and everybody tries everybody's meditations, and everybody listens to everybody's presentation of the Dharma in their country with great appreciation and joy and laughter and empathy. So this is what Buddhists need to do. It's not that we're trying to make the Theravadins into Mahayana or the Mahayana into Theravada. It's not one is superior to the other, because all have produced and do produce great beings, great saints, very realized beings. When we meet any of the great masters of any traditions, and including Muslims, Hindus, Christians, their light which shines through them, that light of wisdom and love, is so genuine that we can see that genuine spirituality doesn't belong to any one particular religion or any one particular technique. Because it's an inner experience. We are all human beings, but we are all Buddha in potential. That can be realized. And so also in the Buddhist schools, all Buddhist schools produce great saints. And all Buddhist schools have realized the nature of the mind. It's not just Tibetan Buddhists. But even with Tibetan Buddhists, His Holiness again has done everything he can to bring harmony among the various traditions. For example, he has the Lachen meeting every year where the great lamas, the high lamas of all the traditions come together. And now, including the Bonpo, of course, and also now including nuns. That is really a revelation, that finally they discovered that the females are also part of the human race and actually able to practice Buddhama and to study and to realize the fruition of the Dharma. And their voice also has a meaning. Their voice also needs to be heard. Since they're more than half the human race, it's about time they were noticed. So His Holiness has done this. And as we know, he visits any monastery or temple of any tradition, including the Bon, with joy and very undiscriminating about their tradition, appreciating everything. We all have seen so many photos of His Holiness wearing hats of all the different traditions. Nyingma hats, Kagyu hats, Sakya hats, Bon hats. Sort of with a smile on his face, but nonetheless, he is saying that, the Dharma goes beyond traditions. It is not just a matter of this one or that one having the ultimate truth. They all have the truth. It's like a diamond with many facets. They're all equally shining and they all make up the diamond. So His Holiness has been exemplary in taking teachings from all the traditions and really appreciating the richness of all the traditions. They are all a part of this divine harmony. It's sort of just come to me. It's like an orchestra. In the West, the orchestras, they have violins and cellos, but they also have wind instruments like trumpets and clarinets, and then have percussion music, and all these different instruments, all making very different sounds, and often playing a slightly different melody, different refrain with the same underlying theme. But when they all come together, then it's glorious harmony. And we are so glad they're not all playing the same tune, that they're all playing variations. Some are going up, some are going down, some are interweaving. And each one contributes to the whole, to the symphony. And so that is religion for you. We don't want everybody to be the same. We want them all to have their variations on a general theme and to play harmoniously together, not to clash. Why clash? When we are all seeking that which is beyond the ego, which is beyond our self-grasping mind. And as we say, even at a simple level, every religion tells us to be good and kind and how to develop love, how to develop compassion. So we should rejoice in the variety, not try to make everyone conform. There's no conformity. There never has been, there never will be. Who wants it? It's the richness of the differences which are so enhancing and so beautiful, along with the inner harmony which we all share, that we want to do good. We want to be good. So why can't we be good? So it's also up to the spiritual leaders to lead the way. Even though nowadays people have lost a lot of faith in traditional religions, people have become more and more disillusioned. Why are they disillusioned? Because the leaders themselves are not living up to their own precepts. They talk about ethics, they talk about love, they talk about peace, but they themselves do not exemplify what they talk about. It's easy to talk. Where is the integrity? So it therefore behoves the masters and the teachers and the guides to genuinely represent what they really are. That, we act the same whether we are in public or whether we are in private, as His Holiness has always said, that there should be no difference between our actions when we're sitting on the throne or our actions behind closed doors. We should have that integrity. And this, I think, is one of the things which is so precious about His Holiness. He has that total integrity. He is completely natural and open in public, and he is completely ethical and pure in private. And we deeply, deeply appreciate that he is indeed the guide for this time. And everyone, whether they are Buddhist or not Buddhist, can recognize this is a good person. And that is what we are all striving for. He shows us how a human being's potential could look. So we are very grateful to His Holiness for everything he has done to help to bring some peace, some understanding, some appreciation and harmony into what otherwise could be a very disputous world of religion and religious experiences. So thank you, Your Holiness. Thank you, all those great beings who hold up the lamp to light the way in this darkness of this present world. We are very deeply grateful. Without their light, how could we find a path? So thank you.
The Dalai Lama is known by Tibetans with many titles that honour his remarkable abilities. Probably the most popular is Gyalwa Rinpoche, the precious victorious one. Tenzin Gyatso, the 14th Dalai Lama, has lost everything imaginable. So how can he be called victorious? Let's explore this. When it comes to the environment, this Buddhist monk, as he simply calls himself, has led the world's turning to our fellow beings consistently for 4 decades or more. For as long as the world was listening, and now beyond into a new world consumed by anger and accusations, he has consistently, patiently reminded us to think long-term, to be mindful of consequences, to respect the sentient beings all around us, and the plants, and all of nature. He is, after all, Chenrezig, Lord of compassion and connection. We tend to think we know this Dalai Lama, but there is more to him than we think. Yes, he has repeatedly, patiently called for a more comprehensive, inclusive, gentle approach to the environment. Yes, he is called the melting of the glaciers an urgent danger, but he also calls for us to widen our perspective, to be more aware of the long as well as short-term consequences of the way our desires become wants, wants become needs, needs become rights. This greatest of Dalai Lamas is master of the long game, able to think far, far ahead, well beyond his generation, any current generation, to the long-term consequences of the decisions we make today, thinking only of the short term. In this time of accelerating speed and short attention spans, we do need voices capable of speaking for the whole planet, for all that lives. Our planet needs a voice, and a reminder that this is our only home. There is no planet B, no fantasy escape to some distant planet for the super-rich to start over. Who else are we willing to listen to as the voice of this, our only home? This Dalai Lama challenges us to think differently, to discover and then question our assumptions about what matters and what can be done. Above all, he takes the long-term view. He reminds us the Tibetan plateau is vast, a major portion of the planetary landscape, not readily destroyed or lost. He reminds us of the inner strengths of Tibetan culture, not all of which come from the Buddhist practice of mind training. He reminds us of how the landscapes of Tibet have spoken to Tibetans over thousands of years. Tibetans gather what nature provides by adapting to the variable generosity of nature. He reminds us the Tibetans learned from the land the values of solitude, spaciousness, and simplicity, which are far better than endlessly proliferating wants. And that's not at all primitive, backward, or uncivilized, nor is it some sort of romantic utopia. Starting in the 1980s, as the world learned to listen, Gyalwa Rinpoche called for universal responsibility with capital letters, at a time when the threat of nuclear annihilation and mutually assured destruction was all that stopped Armageddon from happening. That Cold War world now seems like a distant era, yet now we are again in a time of dualisms, oversimplifications, obsessed with right and wrong, and able to concentrate only on the short term. So maybe universal responsibility is as relevant today as it was 4 decades ago, maybe more than ever, in a time when Chinese leaders refuse to accept there are universals they must conform to, not even universal inborn human rights. Perhaps universal responsibility, however, sounded too grand. People couldn't relate to it as a guide to changing their everyday decisions. So the Dalai Lama found ways we can see what we each need to do. 30 years ago, in a book of photos of the beauty of the lost Tibetan homeland, he speaks to us with such directness. We've gone back 30 years so we can see how consistent this Dalai Lama has been. Looking back to those skillful, gentle, yet sharp reminders about what really matters, we can see the 1992 UN Earth Summit in Rio in Brazil as the moment the world awoke to the terrible power our mastery over nature has given us. The Earth Summit of 1992 saw the world coming together, recognizing the great turning point when our individual and national efforts to force nature to yield more added up to a danger to the planet. The Earth Summit of 1992 was a time of hope that we can all work together to deal effectively with the global crises, plural, of carbon emissions, climate change, biodiversity loss and desertification. 3 new global treaties came out of that Earth Summit. One of the key speakers was the Dalai Lama. He was the voice of the planet, of all that lives, all that normally has no voice in the halls of power. He became a trusted guide because he speaks for us all. Yet here we are, 3 decades later, still arguing about who has how much responsibility for what, who can claim to be reducing emissions or conserving wildlife, while the loopholes and fine print and political spin add up to very little of the Earth Summit's hopes being realised. The arguments go round and round and round. We are repeating our mistakes. It is all too easy to hear this reminder that we are all mother to each other and pass it off as a sentimental cliché or a truth stated too often to have any depth. How come we so quickly move on and don't let it sink in? Maybe it's because all politicians love to say, this earth is our home, we must look after it, and then they do nothing. We even have a phrase in English for the empty platitudes politicians use. We call them motherhood statements. For decades, the Dalai Lama has reminded us of the universal truth of interdependence. With such humour, he showed us the absurdities of our pretense of being masters of our destiny and of the destiny of the whole planet. By his laughter, this Dalai Lama conquers demons and all obstacles to understanding our responsibilities. This greatest of Dalai Lamas teaches us much at once in a few phrases, knowing our attention span is short. He teaches us both the global and the local, the universal and particular, the world and Tibet, warp and weft. He manages to remind us of the singular strengths of Tibetan culture, inner strengths that arise through mind training, inner strengths that come from the spaciousness and freedom of the open range, in a culture that values solitude as revealer of truth. In our accelerating, overcrowded, urbanized, pandemic-prone Anthropocene world, we need these reminders. Solitude and spaciousness are precious. We have forgotten. If Tibetan civilization is lost, the world loses. This Dalai Lama has been adept, in the few seconds we are able to concentrate, in showing us Tibetan culture offers an inner path to revealing the nature of all that exists, a subtle but profound realization of interconnection that can teach us not all wants are needs, not all desires need trigger consumption. The precious Victorious One reminds us all life is precious, this moment is precious. No need to wander aimlessly, repeating our mistakes. Tibetan culture and Tibetan environmentalism are inextricable, two sides of the coin. The vastness of the Tibetan plateau and the vastness of the mind go together. Historically, Tibet was thinly populated by people and densely populated by local spirits of the lakes, mountains, rivers and trees, all of them to be respected. This dense population of local gods pre-exists Buddhism, and the Buddhists never tried to destroy them, only to tame their aggressive tendencies. So they still exist and still remind Tibetans to respect the land. No doubt this old monk, born 1935, is precious. But how can we say he's victorious? For me, an elderly environmentalist, one specific victory stands out. In 2006, many men in Tibet proudly and competitively adorned their best ceremonial dress with tiger skins, smuggled from India, otter skins from Canada, leopard skins from Tibet. Inside Tibet, the lamas and khenpos, who throughout Tibetan history have reminded men not to be so vain and foolish, were silenced by official decrees banning them from public life. But this Dalai Lama, directly addressing Tibetans who had crossed the Himalayas for a once-in-lifetime chance to be in his presence and then return, gave his hearers an earful. In a direct and personal way, this Dalai Lama issued his pith instructions, heart advice on how to live. Here are his words. He wasn't afraid to put his authority on the line. If the fur wearers ignored him, he would have been humiliated. The Dalai Lama had spoken as a human being, investing his whole reputation, jeopardizing the whole trust the Tibetan people have in him. Tibetans were so shocked on hearing these words that within days bonfires were lit all over Tibet, burning furs for which billions had been paid by their wearers. The Dalai Lama was victorious. It was such a victory the wildlife campaigners, such as the powerful Wildlife Trust of India, were amazed, calling this the most successful campaign they had ever initiated. The bond of trust the Tibetans have in their Dalai Lama, far from them in another land, was palpable for all to see, transcending time and space. This victory was dramatic but not unusual. The 6 million Tibetans in Tibet have kept their deep trust and faith in the Dalai Lama, despite all the pressures to urbanize, speed up, and see nature as just something for human exploitation. If anything, Tibetans in Tibet have deepened their devotion to this Lama, despite never being in the presence of his presence. Other victories of the victorious Precious One may not be apparent for a long time. His infinite patience, his hopes that as China prospers it will learn to be more relaxed and flexible, show little sign of bearing fruit right now. Only over a longer period will we learn whether China's leaders can drop their racist contempt, can recognize the humanity of the Tibetans, and the precious strengths of Tibetan culture. It is in their own self-interest to let Tibetans be Tibetan, let Uyghurs be Uyghur. All governments want to be trusted and loved, but you can't force anyone to love you. The use of force can only alienate those you want to win over. It is self-defeating. At some point, this must become apparent, even to the central leaders in Beijing. Perhaps the greatest victory of the victorious one is that Tibetan landscapes, Tibetan ecosystems and Tibetan culture have survived, and the world knows about Tibet. In the terrible 20th century, Tibet could just have become roadkill, casually run over by mechanical power and never even noticed dead by the highway. That has happened all over the world, all too often. Why do so many people worldwide care about Tibet? Its rivers and glaciers, endless pastures and biodiversity hotspots. Tibetans know this, above all, is the achievement of one simple Buddhist monk, whose laughter deflates the pomposities of propaganda, cuts through the empty slogans of state power imposing its ecological civilization on a vast land that didn't need mending. Gyalpa Rinpoche, Tenzin Gatsal, the greatest of the Dalai Lamas, with his laughter, tramples the demons, opens hearts and minds to reality. Meanwhile, inside Tibet, Tibetans not only burn their furs, they actively conserve biodiversity, work as park rangers, set up ecotourism homestays in remote areas for foreign guests yearning to see such rare creatures as snow leopards in the wild. These Tibetan conservationists skillfully align with official policy that promotes tourism in national parks. Quietly, these Tibetans implement the Dalai Lama's vision of Tibet as a zone of peace and cooperation where we can all cooperate. If there is one word that defines this time we live in now, it is suspicion. At a political level, the diplomats have been sidelined. Institutions of mutual and multilateral cooperation weakened, and the security state everywhere is taking over. Suspicious minds now rule. Between countries and between communities, the dominant driver is suspicion that those people, are up to no good, are out to do us harm. Suspicion of foreigners, of migrants, of protesters, of predatory governments now drive public policy, drive media, drive us to divide us all against each other. The security professions profess suspicion. Their job is to be suspicious. If you have a suspicious mind, you'll find plenty to be suspicious of, confirming you are right to be suspicious. It's a self-reinforcing loop of delusions. So we need to open our eyes and ears and hearts to this greatest of Dalai Lamas more than ever. A world overwhelmed by suspicion and fear is a world incapable of acting as a world, working together, cooperatively, to deal with world problems such as climate change, global pandemics, catastrophic loss of diversity, and extremes of inequality, the issues this Dalai Lama has been reminding us of for 4 decades and more. We can't go on like this. We turned to the security state and its professionally suspicious mindset to protect us from threats, but we are now trapped in a trap of our own making. Who can lead us out of this trap we made? Who reminds us humans are by nature sociable, loving, capable of generative trust and mutual aid? Who can guide us in these increasingly precarious, perilous times? When the Dalai Lama speaks of nature, he reminds us of our human nature. The vast landscapes of Tibet speak to us too, of the need for spaciousness and solitude, to take time out, to relax our suspicious, competitive, driven mind frames and try a different approach. The Dalai Lama is our guide.
Hi, I'm John Powers. I'm a professor at Deakin University in Australia. I work primarily on Tibetan Buddhism as well as Indian Buddhism. A lot of my work is on philosophical texts, and I also have done quite a bit of work on Chinese propaganda relating to Tibetan Buddhism and Chinese government claims about it. And this is all going to factor into what I'm going to be talking about today, which is about His Holiness's claims about Nalanda University and its impact on Tibetan Buddhism. I'm going to talk today about His Holiness's claim that Tibetan Buddhism derives entirely from Nalanda University. What I'm going to talk about is, first of all, what he says about this, and then what's behind the claim, why the claim is important, and then I will do a brief evaluation of the claim. So, to begin with, His Holiness says, and this is a quote, "Tibetan Buddhism is not the invention of the Tibetans. Rather, it is quite clear that it derives from the pure lineage of the tradition of the Nalanda monastery. The Master Nagarjuna hailed from this institution, as did many other important philosophers and logicians." So this sort of summarizes his idea about the connection between Tibetan Buddhism and Nalanda. So again, I'm going to talk about what's behind the statement, the implications of the statement, and then talk about what this all means. So the background of the statement is that His Holiness is thinking about, in the back of his mind, is probably a long tradition of characterization of Tibetan Buddhism, which begins in China, where Tibetan Buddhism has been referred to in the past as Lama Jiao, literally Lamaism, which differentiates it from true Buddhism, Fo Jiao, that is the tradition of the Buddha. And this was picked up on by Western scholars who came to Asia and studied, and they encountered, first of all, a number of various Buddhist traditions, and for many of them, the tradition that represented orthodoxy was Theravada, the name of which means teachings of the elders. And it claims to be a tradition that traces itself directly back to the Buddha, and that dismisses the claims of other Buddhist traditions to their claims of orthodoxy. And so this became, for many of them, for many Westerners, the basis for which they evaluated other Buddhist traditions. And they saw Tibetan Buddhism as being about as far away as it was possible to get from the pure tradition of the Buddha. And they coined the term Lamaism to differentiate Tibetan Buddhism from other types of Buddhism. This, by the way, is a term that virtually all Tibetan Buddhists reject. What it implies is that Tibetan Buddhism is about veneration of lamas and is not true Buddhism, is that it's a bastardization of Buddhism, a corruption of Buddhism based on the veneration of human masters. And this, again, is something that Tibetan Buddhists deny. So one of the things that His Holiness is doing in making the claim about Nalanda is he is implicitly denying this idea that there is anything non-orthodox about Tibetan Buddhism, and he is tracing it back to Indian origins that he sees as being entirely orthodox, that is particularly Nalanda Monastery. It also it has a more recent aspect to it, that is that the Chinese government is actively involved in trying to redefine what Tibetan Buddhism is, and has produced a series of pamphlets that are required reading in all Tibetan monasteries. The headline of most of these is Reinterpreting Tibetan Buddhist Doctrines. And the claim is that Tibetan Buddhism can be redefined. That is, that it should be redefined in accordance with socialist principles as understood by the Chinese government. And it also claims that Tibetan Buddhism has always adapted itself to what the government wants it to be and how it wants it to be. And this is something that, again, His Holiness is denying. He's also denying, in his statement, the idea that the Chinese government has authority to make these sorts of claims. That is, he is saying that Tibetan Buddhism is entirely derived from India, that it has virtually nothing to do with China, or nothing important to do with China, and therefore the Chinese government has no real say about what Tibetan Buddhism is, and no valid claims to authority over it. So, it also harkens back to a long tradition of orthodoxy in Tibetan Buddhism, that you can see right from the very beginnings when Buddhism first began to be imported from India, from the 7th to 9th centuries. One of the principles in terms of what sort of texts Tibetans would accept was that any text, particularly tantric texts, had to have a Sanskrit version of them. texts that didn't have Sanskrit versions were deemed to be spurious, that is, were apocryphal texts. They weren't Orthodox Indian texts. And so, by and large, texts that didn't have Sanskrit versions were rejected as being apocryphal texts and not as being authentic texts. And that idea of India as being the source from which orthodoxy is derived goes back a long, long way. So, first of all, I'd like to talk a bit about what Nalanda was to give a bit of context. So, Nalanda Monastery was one of the great institutions of learning in the ancient world. It was founded probably around the 2nd century AD. It was patronized by the Gupta kings of northern India from the 5th to 6th centuries and greatly expanded. And it reached its peak from about 427 until 1197. And it attracted people from all over the world. It had students from Southeast Asia, from Greece, from Persia, from China, from Japan, all over the world. People would come to study at Nalanda. It had at its peak about 10,000 students and about 2,000 teachers. The remains of the monastery today cover 14 hectares in a site that's about 88 kilometers away from Patna in modern-day Bihar. It was a massive place. It had a huge library. The library was burned in the 13th century by Muslim invaders, and this also marked the end of Nalanda as an effective teaching institution. And the reports of the time said that the fires burned for months. It was such a large library. But by the 13th century, it had largely disappeared. It had largely ceased to function as an effective center of learning. The last throne holder, Shakti Bhadra, fled to Tibet in 1204. It may have continued to function in some capacity until the 15th century, but from the 13th century onward, it was no longer an effective or a viable center of learning. But during its heyday, it was certainly one of the great centers of learning in the Buddhist world. And many of the most important figures for Tibet and for Tibetan Buddhism hailed from Nalanda. They were teachers at Nalanda. They wrote their treatises at Nalanda. And many of the eminent Tibetan scholars in the early period traveled to Nalanda to study. So there is a strong connection between Tibet and Nalanda. Now, that said, it should also be mentioned that there were other sources of Tibetan Buddhism. There were other important monasteries in northern India, such as Vikramashila and Odantapuri. Vikramashila eclipsed Nalanda in about the 10th century as the major seat of Tibetan learning, of Buddhist learning. And so it also played a very important role in the transmission of Buddhism to Tibet, and Odantapuri and other monasteries played a lesser role. The other thing that should be mentioned, too, is that it wasn't just the monasteries that were the sources of Buddhism for Tibet. Another important source of what Tibetan Buddhism became were the Siddha lineages of northern India that were mostly centered in Bihar and Bengal. These were largely tantric-oriented coteries of students and charismatic teachers. They often had oral literature, oral lore that was passed on from masters to students, and this was also transmitted to Tibet, often by individuals rather than sort of institutionally, as, say, when people traveled to Nalanda and when Nalanda teachers traveled to Tibet. But these two sources are really very important together in shaping what Tibetan Buddhism became. So the more scholastic traditions, like particularly the Gelugpas, have a very strong connection with the scholastic traditions of the North Indian monasteries like Nalanda. The Gagyu school traces itself more closely to the Siddha lineages. The Sagya school, for instance, is more a mixture of both. Some of the siddhas, like Virupa, for instance, are important in the Sagya school, as are some of the scholastic teachers who were associated with Nalanda and Vikramashila. And the Nyingma school traces itself back to the earlier period, before Nalanda became the main source of importation of Buddhism to Tibet. Tibetan Buddhism is commonly separated into two phases, an early propagation and a later propagation. The early propagation happened from the 7th century to the 9th century. It was sponsored by the kings of Tibet, beginning with Tri Songtsen Gampo. According to tradition, there were a number of competitions, people competing for influence in Tibet, and these included Chinese teachers. The most famous of these is Hashang Mahayana, or Hashang Mohoyan, who was a Chan teacher who traveled to Tibet and apparently attracted a fairly substantial following. Traditional histories report that matters came to a head in the 9th century, and the king, Trisong Detsen, sponsored a debate between the two at Samye, and that the conclusion of the debate was that the Chinese side was heretical and that the Indian side was orthodox. And the Indian side championed traditional Indian Mahayana Buddhism, a gradualist path to Buddhahood, focusing on the 6 perfections, training toward Buddhahood as a bodhisattva over a course of time. Hashang Mahayana, according to tradition, emphasized a sudden path to awakening, in which you would become a Buddha all of a sudden, and in which the traditional trainings, particularly in things like ethics, were not important, because in a flash of inspiration you could instantly become a Buddha. So these two traditions, according to the story, came into conflict. The king decided that the Indian side was orthodox and the Chinese side was forbidden to teach its doctrines. Now, it should be mentioned that there are a number of problems with the story, and there are a number of contemporary scholars who think that it probably didn't happen in the way that it did, and some who, I think with a lot of evidence, think that it probably never happened at all. And that the traditional story may well summarize a series of encounters between people representing Chinese lineages and people representing Indian lineages, and that the contest was summarized in a single winner-take-all debate story, and that summarized what the Tibetans concluded, that is, that Indian Buddhism was orthodox and the Chinese Buddhism was heterodox. And so that became that became the lesson that the Tibetans derived from that story. Now, again, whether the debate happened or not is not really important, because for Tibetans who accepted the historicity of the debate, the lesson was that Indian Buddhism is orthodox and Chinese Buddhism is heterodox. And this is one of the things that His Holiness is hearkening back to in making his claim about Nalanda. That is, Tibetans decided fairly early on that Indian Buddhism was going to be the source of orthodoxy, and that Chinese Buddhism was not the true Dharma. And so when Buddhism was revived in Tibet, in the second dissemination, there was no question that India would be the sole source for this. And one of the most important places that Tibetans traveled to, and from which they imported teachers, was Nalanda University. So in that sense, His Holiness is correct. That is, that there is a strong connection between Nalanda and Tibet, and many of the great teachers at Nalanda played an important role in Tibetan Buddhism. Another thing that should be mentioned here is that the character of Tibetan Buddhism is quite different from that of Chinese Buddhism. So Chinese Buddhism is largely based on sutras. So most of the important Chinese schools have a particular sutra that they see as representing the Buddha's final word, and they base their doctrines and practices on that. For Tibetan Buddhism, shastras, or philosophical treatises, are far more important than sutras are. And that's been true from a very early period. So the schools of Tibetan Buddhism largely derive their philosophical traditions from people like Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti, Shantideva, Asanga, Vasubandhu, and so forth, all of whom have associations with Nalanda. So in that sense, there is a very strong connection between the traditions that became orthodox and that played leading roles in Tibetan Buddhism and the type of Buddhism that that Tibet developed. Now, another thing that's important here is that this also goes back to the treatises that are published by the Chinese government, which tend to conflate Tibetan Buddhism and Chinese Buddhism. So the first treatise in the first pamphlet in this series, interpreting Tibetan Buddhist doctrines, begins with a statement that Tibetan Buddhism focuses on sutras, and all of its doctrines are derived from sutras. And the Tibetan monks will get together in the Grand Sutra Hall and chant their sutras on a regular basis. Now, this is true of East Asian forms of Buddhism, but it's not true of Tibetan Buddhism. I don't know of any Tibetan monastery, at least that I've ever heard of, that has a Grand Sutra Hall. But this is a standard feature in East Asian monasteries, particularly in China. So the Chinese people who are writing this are not scholars. They don't know much about they don't know virtually anything about Tibetan Buddhism. They know next to nothing about Indian Buddhism, and they actually know very little about Chinese Buddhism too. Their knowledge of Chinese Buddhism is quite superficial. Their goal really is propaganda, and behind the propaganda is a statement, is an assumption that the Chinese government has a legitimate claim on Tibet and on its people and on its culture, and that Tibetans should adjust their beliefs according to what the government of China tells them they believe. And they believe that propaganda properly applied will convince people to shift their beliefs. One of the problems for Tibetans is that most of them really don't accept this, and they will find very little in the Chinese-produced pamphlets telling them what the doctrines of Tibetan Buddhism are that has any sort of resonance with the sorts of things that they know of as Tibetan Buddhism. So His Holiness, in making this statement about Nalanda, is attempting to deny the Chinese government any sort of authority to make the sorts of claims that it's making, and to be able to characterize Tibetan Buddhism for Tibetans. It also goes back to where the sources of authority lie in Buddhist traditions. So in East Asia, China became the source of orthodoxy. When Buddhists in Japan or Korea had questions about what the true Dharma was, they would go to China as a general, very seldom to India. But when Tibetans had questions about the Dharma, they traveled to India. So India, from a very early period for Tibetans, was seen as the source of the Dharma. And so this is also something that counteracts the Chinese narrative about Tibetan Buddhism. So to evaluate His Holiness's claim, he is justified in making this claim of a connection to Nalanda. As I mentioned, there's a long-standing tradition of Tibetans traveling to Nalanda, as well as to Vikramashila and Urdantapuri to a lesser extent, to travel. Many of the great scholars of Nalanda traveled to Tibet to study. Most of the important treatises that are foundational for Tibetan Buddhist orders, like the Sakyapas, the Gelugpas, and the Nyingmapas, and the Kagyapas, were all composed in India, very often by people who worked at Nalanda. So there is a strong connection to Nalanda. It also serves to marginalize the Chinese government in this, because by looking far, far back, that is, to a tradition that begins in the 2nd century in India, continues on through the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries, and then begins to become the main source of importation of Buddhism to Tibet, he is effectively sidelining China as having any sort of role in this. So from at least the 9th century, as I mentioned, Tibetans viewed Chinese Buddhism as heterodox. Now, that doesn't mean that Tibetans didn't travel to China and the Chinese didn't travel to Tibet, although actually very few Chinese have ever really traveled to Tibet to study Buddhism. But when Tibetans traveled to China, they generally, I really don't know of any who went there as students. That is, to study Chinese Buddhism. It simply wasn't something that most Tibetans would have ever considered. They went there as teachers, they went there as miracle workers, people who had miraculous powers that could cure illness and bring fortune and so forth. But they weren't, they were generally, they came as teachers rather than as students. Because again, for Tibetans, they wouldn't think of China as being a source of true Dharma. So His Holiness is making this point for Tibetans, that is, don't listen to what the Chinese are saying. India is the source of true orthodoxy. And when you look at history, he says, you can see that from a very early period, India was the source of the Dharma coming into Tibet. And the Tibetans continue to follow that Dharma today. And if you look at the Indian canon and at the history of Tibetan exegetical works, there is a tradition that continues today. I'm currently involved in 2 projects that are basically looking at the tradition of commentaries on Indian Shastra texts written by Nalanda exegetes that then became the sources of commentarial traditions in Tibet. And this continues today, and there are still Tibetan teachers who are composing commentaries as we speak on Indian Shastras that derive from Nalanda. So to that extent, His Holiness is correct in what he says. But as I mentioned earlier, it's also more complicated than that.